So what is SQL? So SQL stands for Structure Query Language. So what SQL is, it's a language designed for managing data in a relational database. You know, there's a lot of new words here. So for example, we care about that it's a relational database. We'll talk about more what relational means. And also it's a database. That's kind of new. What is a database exactly? And also what does query mean? What's important is that SQL or SQL, in case you want to know how to pronounce it, I used to pronounce it SQL, but apparently a lot of people say you should pronounce it SQL. And then, I don't know, maybe you could also pronounce it skill. But anyways, so yeah, so there's a lot of way of saying SQL, but I'll just say SQL from now on because that's what most people use. So what is SQL? So SQL is not like a language like C++ or Python. Those are more like scripting or like programming languages where you can build applications or build binaries. So SQL is not meant for that, but it's used to query and manage a database. And in this course, we'll be focusing on how to query data out of a database and compose more complex queries to analyze large sets of data. All right, so let's talk about databases. What is a database? Well, a database is simply an organized collection of data. So technically, if you have a bunch of paper and you have a bunch of names, address, and maybe phone numbers on them, and you put that away in a folder and you put that folder in, I don't know, like your locker or something, that is technically a database because you are organizing the data inside that folder. However, most commonly used in the tech industry, a database is a program that manages your data. Like, for example, MySQL. You might have heard a lot of these terms before, or Postgres. Another one is SQLite. And then also Microsoft, I think they have their own one, which is called MS SQL. So these are all programs. Technically, MongoDB is also a database, but it's a little bit different than these ones because they are collection-based and they're not a relational database. Let's draw a little figure to show you how exactly these things are related to each other. So for example, you are the user, all right? You are the user, and you have a bunch of data, which I'll show right here. You have a bunch of data, and let's say they're like little data, bunch of information. So then what SQL is, it's a language. So you're going to be writing SQL so that you can interact with a database. This is a database program like MySQL, and that program manages your data, right? So for example, MySQL manages the data. So instead of the user going directly to the data where you can, for example, where you have a bunch of paper with names and addresses and whatever information you want to put in there, instead of organizing it yourself, you can download a program called maybe MySQL, which is a database program, to help you manage all that data. So then how would you get access to that data? How can you query that data? Well, you use SQL, the language. And then once you use SQL, you can actually query the database. So you give it a request or you write a query. And then what the database would do is they would do their own internal algorithm that would search up the data. They'll interpret your query, and then they will spit out the data to you in an organized fashion so that you can finally read that data and then do something about it. And essentially, a lot of data analysts, that's what they do most of the time. What they do is they have a database with a bunch of information about their company, and then they will use SQL to request and query the data from the database, and only the important data, so that they can understand what's happening with their company. They are going to use data, massive amounts of data, to allow them to create strategies for their team, right? A very simple one. Imagine if you're a YouTuber, you want to understand which one of my videos are performing the best. How can I grow my channel? So you, as a user or a data analyst, can look at all your YouTube videos and then sort them by whichever that has the most views, And then once you have the one that has the most views, you can understand, oh, I think this content direction would be the best for my channel. And there you go. Now, mind that depending on your database program, either MySQL, Postgres, or SQLite, the SQL language that you write to your database program might be a little bit different. But they should be very, very similar, and it wouldn't be a blocker if, for example, you've done a lot of analysis using MySQL, but then suddenly you change to a Postgres SQL. It doesn't matter. It's pretty much the same thing. All right, so a common question we get is, what about Excel, that organized data? Is that a database? Well, technically, yes. So here we have Google Sheets, which is very similar to Excel. So technically, this is a database if you are using the definition of organized collection of data, because you are organizing data here. But when we refer to databases, we usually mean database programs like MySQL, PostgreSQL, that are built to handle lots of data and can serve many users and has a robust schema. So what exactly is a schema? So a schema is basically a structure for your data. They are rules so that you can be consistent on how the data is represented. For example, let's look at this Excel sheet. So here, because you might be familiar with what tables are, then you know that these are columns. You have multiple columns here, and then you have rows here, and then the rows are the data, and then the columns tell you what kind of data you'll get, right? For example, descript, this means description of the crime reports, and then you get a bunch of strings, and then date, you get a bunch of date. But in Excel, technically, you don't need to follow the schema. There is no schema. You could change it up. You could add numbers here instead, right? So then you're not really, you can do a lot of different things here, right? You can kind of mess around with it, right? And also there are some Excel sheets that don't even need to follow this schema. For example, a bunch of numbers here. Let's just have another number. And then you could decide to have maybe like names here, like John, David, Alex. And then maybe if you want, you can also just put random dollar signs, like how much these people owe you here. For example, let's just say this is their age. And then, yeah, so basically there's no schema. You could do whatever you want. It is more flexible, but without the robustness, it kind of lacks consistency, right? So let's go back to databases. So a database is usually represented like this, right? So imagine this is your database. And let's call this database, let's see, database 1, right? You call it database 1. Or you can call it the crime database. And then you, as a user, you have access to this database. And then what you can do, you can also create table. So in the database, you can have multiple tables. And then what tables look like is you have maybe like columns. And then you have like data. And then you have multiple of these tables. And then these tables help you organize data. So the database manages these tables. And then underlying the tables, you have the data, right? Because that's what the tables are made out of. And then let's say this table name is US crimes, right? This table will record all the crimes happening in the US. For each table, you could think of it as the columns, but you have a schema. And let's say the schema says you have an ID. You need to have an ID. And then you need to have the description of the crime. And then you also have the name, the person who committed the crime, let's say. And then here, ID, it should be an integer. And then description should be a string. And name should be a string. So this is a schema, right? Because there's a schema, you're not allowed to put a number on the column description, or you're not allowed to put a number on the column name. And for ID, you have to put a number. The schemas are basically rules on what kind of data can be put in your table. It's less flexible, but it helps being consistent, and consistency helps organization, which allows the database to manage your data in a very efficient way. now that you, the user, created a table called US crimes inside of the database crime database, how do we even get access to this table? Well, let me tell you how tables are named. Let's say your name, my user, is Joma, right? So then the table name, this table name will be Joma.uscrimes. So this will be your table name because you created this table. Joma created this table, and it will be stored inside the crime database. So let's look at example using mode to see how this is in action. So here is the SQL editor. And let's say I want to query this table. These are all table names. I double click it. As you can see, the username is Tutorial. So probably someone named Tutorial created this table. And then the table name is Playbook Emails, right? And then the database is Mode Public Warehouse, which is available to everyone. All right, so right now it's kind of abstracted, like what the table actually, what the database name actually is. But I think this database is called Mode Public Warehouse. And then there are many users that can add databases inside here. This is just a practice. This is just a playground for everyone to play. Usually when you have a database, it's secured and it's only for you and for your applications. And then let's query this. I'll teach you later on in the next courses what these commands are, but let's run this. Aha. So now this is the result that we got. So the table would kind of look like this. Right now I limited it to only 10 rows, but the table looks like this. And the schema is that the first column is a user ID, which is a number. And then the second column is a date named occurred at. And then the third one is action. So I'm guessing that this database records every action that happened in the website playbook. I guess it's kind of like Facebook, but they kind of reworded it to say playbook. These are all fake data, by the way. So essentially the result tells me that this user, its user is ID 8. What they did was it sent, the user sent weekly digests multiple times throughout the day. Oh, that's not throughout the day, it's throughout like weeks and months. That's what their action is. And as you can see, if ever I want to modify these actions or these rows, you have to stick to the schema. I have to put a date here, I have to put a string here, and I have to put a number here. So that's pretty much what SQL is. It is a language that we use to query a database, and that database is managed by a database program like MySQL, PostgreSQL, SQLite. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.